He hails from Cape Town, South Africa. He's a holder of a PhD in politics from the University of London. He also holds an MA in political science from Northwestern University. Professor Sean Jacobs is also the author of numerous articles in various publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Politique Africaine, to name but a few. He's also the editor of a book about the South African former president, Thabo Mbeki, actually called Thabo Mbeki's World, the Politics and Ideology of the South African President. Professor Jacob is right here in the studios to discuss with us the South African elections that are being conducted today. Professor, welcome to SaharaTV.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we have 20 years of South Africa's independence, and we also have the ANC in position as the main party. What is the meaning of these elections at this time, and also because the South African born-frees will be able to vote for the first time?
I mean, this is the first election that South Africans will vote without Nelson Mandela present. I mean, though he had not been involved in South African politics for more than a decade,
right?
His presence, it sort of loomed over South African politics in the way that he would rebuke, say, ANC leaders publicly,
right,
for their corruption or for the lack of consultation, or the way in which he supported AIDS activists by, publicly going to them and then embracing them and appearing with them on camera. So he's not there. And on the other hand, the ANC has progressively over this time become embroiled in scandal, corruption, lack of delivery. So this might be the last time that they can almost use Nelson Mandela as a trump card. Nelson Mandela and the people, who along with him are associated with freeing South Africa.
Okay.
So this is that moment, and for these young people, the people born after the end of apartheid or born when he came out of prison, they have no memory of apartheid. For them, that's something their parents talk about. They might still live in a township. Their mother might, they might see their parents still suffering, but in their estimation, it's the ANC government who's responsible for their conditions, like where they live, where they go to school, what kind of services they get. So their judgment is with the ANC.
Okay, so now there's also been sentiments about how disinterested and unwilling to vote these born-frees have, and only 1/3 of the, the population of the 18 to 19-year-olds have been registered to vote, and that's according to the IEC. Now, one of them here says that I realize what I'm going to vote for. I don't believe in our government leaders and their empty promises. And he's only 19 years old. His name is Asanda Mkwane. So why do you think they have this kind of attitude towards?
I mean, I think there's two things. One, I think there is definitely that attitude is sort of the pressing attitude towards elections. That's real, because on the one hand, the ANC can afford to do nothing. And, I think it's become arrogant in the way that it dominates South African politics, so it doesn't really have to care anymore. There are strikes, there are protests, there are communities where today people did not turn up to vote because they are mad at the ANC. But on the other hand, the opposition is, terrible, doesn't respond to people's needs. But then another factor is a lot of South Africans don't just think about elections anymore. A lot happens in between elections. There are these emergence of all kinds of social movements.
Right.
Then the trade union movement, around housing, around healthcare, around schooling, and that's where people are beginning to put their energy.
Okay, so it's also predicted that obviously the ANC is going to be the victor in the presidential elections and the general elections. So it's been 20 years. Could this be out of that people are still carrying that memory of this is the Liberation Party, they made us enjoy the end of apartheid, and it's out of respect? Could that be the case?
I mean, I think it's partly to do with the way that South Africa operates or is organized, the racial political economy, in other words, how South Africa looks, which is that inequality in South Africa is still largely organized around race. Black people are mostly or exclusively poor. White people, still own much of the means of production. They run the economy. They live in the suburbs. If you're a poor black South African living in a township and you're taking a bus or a taxi into the city, then you can see this. It's in the physical landscape. The only organization or party that claims, just at a rhetorical level, to do something about that is the ANC. the opposition, the main opposition party in South Africa is identified with protecting the interests of whites, their privileges. They are against any forms of affirmative action, any forms of redress. So when people look at this, they think, you know, the ANC is still the only party that can do for them. But at the same time, you're right, history is important in South Africa.
Right.
People, if you're a young black South African, even if you're like 19-year-old or 20-year-old, in your house, your mother, your grandmother, they lived through apartheid. I mean, I lived through apartheid.
Right.
I went to high school still under apartheid. So in my memory, it's very hard to imagine a future even without the ANC. So, you know, these things are real. Yeah.
Okay, now the presidency of President Zuma has been scarred and marred by a lot of scandal, including his, you know, gaffes when he talked about AIDS and saying that he could just take a shower and it would go away. When he married numerous wives, and I think he keeps going. And then there's been the latest, the Nkandla, you know, developing the Nkandla rural home, where he's allegedly used the public funds and denied that these were public funds to the tune of 20 million. Why do you think the ANC allowed him then to run into this presidency? Because just before the elections, it was kind of like brushed under the carpet, if I could use that
I mean,
word.
there are many reasons. One is they can afford to. They know they can win. And there's a sense among some people that when the elections is over, they might then ask him, you know, to step aside and ask one of the other ANC leaders to
step in
and become president. The other options are, they also have problems. Like the deputy president of the ANC is implicated in the Marikana, you know, massacre of miners. On the other hand, I think the issue with Jacob Zuma was when he became president of the ANC and president of the country, he was very popular because his predecessor, Thabo Mbeki, who was, you know, very good at handling the economy for business, and was a very good negotiator, and, you know, the way that he represented South Africa on the African continent. South Africa became much more of an African country under him. But at the same time, locally, under him, black people became poorer. You know, things became privatized.
Right.
So there was a lot of disquiet with Thabo Mbeki. There's the whole arms scandal. In that vacuum, the unions, the Communist Party, because, you know, they're still prominent in South Africa.
Right.
They organized around Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma was going to be the linchpin. He was the man who would, you know, pick up the fight and pick up the spear and change the lives of ordinary people. Unfortunately, I mean, this is the problem of, you know, hitching your cause to an individual or a figure.
Right.
Is that he also turns out to have clay feet. He's quite corrupt. You know, he
fails to perform.
He fails to perform. There's no decisive leadership on his part except to take care of either his own house or his family. So in a way, I think there's a lot of disappointment in the ANC, and you can see how people are voting by holding their nose. They, you know, they stink, but they're voting anyway because they're so committed and they have such a long relationship.
I'm going to read a quote here from a South African political commentator. His name is Justice Malala. So he says, many are hoping that the ANC will get a scare in these elections and begin to reflect on some of its failures. So I think what he's trying to say in context of what he was talking about is their drop in number of votes in this current election. So do you think that the ANC is going to get that scare? And how do you think they'll respond to this scare?
On a number of fronts, I think the ANC is, you know, they faced over the last 20 years, the major opposition party was this white opposition party. But increasingly, black South Africans, which is the majority, where the majority of the politics is happening, there's a lot of disquiet. You saw the emergence of Julius Malema.
Right.
Now, how far that can go is unclear. We will only know that by tomorrow. But with him, I mean, that's not a real political project, I think, in a sense. The more interesting things are happening, and this is probably where the scare is coming from the unions. The trade union movement, they have reluctantly endorsed the ANC in this election. Some of their biggest affiliates have broken away from the ANC. The National Union of Metal Workers, which is an important union in South Africa, they have declared that for the next election, they're working towards forming their own political party.
Right.
That's going to be really interesting. The Marikana massacre, I think, is also important. That for many people,
it's still fresh.
Yeah, they looked at the ANC for
unresolved.
leadership, and now the ANC is associated with violence against poor black people, shooting them in,
something that reminds them of the apartheid
apartheid
days.
So there you've seen also from the National Union of Mine Workers, a new union emerged called AMCU. I think that's where I think the interesting politics are going to come from in the cities, with young school children who are protesting around, proper conditions around in their classrooms.
Right.
So yes, this might be the last election where the ANC can count on their support, but by the next one, I'm not so sure.
Okay, so I know the next one will be 2019, and then I think another one in 2024, actually. So now Julius Malema and this Economic Freedom Fighters Party, the word fighters and the whole stance of toying on the streets and the militancy. South Africa left apartheid, and then you had a president like Nelson Mandela who reconciled, who called and appealed to the people's senses to create what he called a rainbow nation and start rebuilding. And everything died down. Then after Mbeki and then Zuma, then you'd hear songs like Mshinwa, Mshinwa, almost reminding people of fighting. Do you think that at this point, Julius Malema, who has quite a following, at this point South Africans are going to pay attention to that kind of politics?
I think that's again a reflection of dissatisfaction with the failure that people haven't seen any real change in the way they live. So listening to this music, this rhetoric, this kind of, the style, everything appeals to them, takes them back to a time when they were unified
and fought
for something.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think a lot of the fascination with Julius Malema stems from the media. Julius Malema is a colorful figure, wears a beret,
right.
Makes kind of soundbite, he plays soundbite
and
politics.
He enjoys the cameras.
He enjoys the cameras,
right.
And he's a bit of a pop star. He's very popular among young people, as you said earlier.
Right.
We're not sure whether they may not, they turn up in low numbers to vote. So a lot of the fascination with him is, I'm going to go. Julius is at the stadium today. Let's go see him. When it comes down to it, I think he will probably take less than 10% of the vote, well, less than 5 maybe. And because many of the people who are sort of looking at him, they're just doing it to send a message to the ANC,
right.
And they'll probably go back to the ANC. He also hasn't offered up anything concrete.
Concrete for them to...
in the people around him, it's a very thin kind of organizational layer. And it might just be something that's very much, because of elections right now.
Okay, what about the Democratic Alliance Party?
The Democratic Alliance has existed since 1994. And in that period, they have only come up to 20%. So over a period of 20 years, they went from, 0 to 20%. At that same time, there was a small party called COPE, which was formed couple of months before the last election. They went from 0 to something like 5% in a couple of months. Malema probably will get, between 4 and 5%. So it shows you that because of the nature of, it's a party with its history in white politics. Right. It has a very strident attitude. It's very critical of the new order. So people associate it, for better or worse, people think of it as a party that wants to represent and preserve white privilege. They may have now, they have a black leader running in one of the provinces.
Right.
Many of the leaders underneath the main leader, Helen Zille,
right.
Are black. But even her rhetoric, the way she talks about black people sometimes is quite racist. Her comments about people who are not from the Western Cape who are black, this is the province that the Democratic Alliance governs, she has referred to them at times as refugees. The refugees in their own country so it's not appealing. I think they would have to make a conscious choice, and not because they think, oh, we need a black leader, so they pick anybody, and this is what they tried to do when they appointed Mampela Rampela, who's a former World Bank governor, and it didn't work out because of the way that their parties run. But they would have to make a conscious choice about who's the figurehead of the party. And most probably they're going to have to pick somebody who's black. But at the same time, also their policies have to appeal to black people.
Okay, now in closing, thank you very much for joining us. South Africa is called the Rainbow Nation, and the policies of apartheid were segregation. people were classified. And obviously the major class was the white race, the Caucasian, and the coloreds. And in South Africa, colored would refer to people biracial, mixed race. So how has the harmony in this 20 years crossed over?
I mean, the Rainbow Nation in South Africa I think it's a facade. It's something that appears when people are at a rugby match or, some sports event. When the sports event is over, the truth is that the way South Africans live, I think that the real test for South Africa is that the neighborhoods aren't integrated. Yes, there are the integration of the sort of middle class, which is a small part of the population, where you have a kind of non-racial, black, white, colored Indian, new immigrants from the Congo, Zimbabweans, who are also now South Africans. There's a place in which all of them coexist. But outside of that bubble,
back to business. It's
still back to business. It's highly racialized.
Hate.
People still use quite racist language towards it. If you go online on websites like News24 or the comment sections of the Mail and Guardian, it will shock you at the kind of defensive posture of most whites in the way that they talk about apartheid, pretending it never happened. So the rainbow, I think, is more a marketing slogan, rather than a reality in South Africa. South Africa can only become a real rainbow if you deal with those massive inequalities in which race is a form of class. Yeah.
Is South Africa a xenophobic nation?
I mean, definitely. How else could they not be? This is a country in which people were taught through their schooling, including black South Africans, to hate other people who are different than you. I mean, black people resisted that idea. The ANC, I think, and the movements that organized against apartheid fought hard against that notion of difference. But if you are taught, that everybody is, where difference is emphasized, secondly, that it's a country under siege. Throughout apartheid, very few South Africans traveled, both white, black, everybody. Secondly, there was very little interaction with people from elsewhere. Most South Africans learn about foreigners through what politicians say or what they hear through the media. They rarely meet people who are from somewhere else. So I'm not surprised when South Africa is deeply xenophobic. The education, I think, that people receive has very little about the fact that they are in Africa. That they live on the African continent. Finally, also, the way that South Africans learn about history, they don't know, very few know that actually Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, Namibia was occupied. It was a colony of South Africa. They had to pay the price because of apartheid. Few South Africans know that.
They don't.
They just assume these people are coming here, they're trying to take my job. They know very little about the fact that sometimes South Africans had to go live there, fleeing apartheid. And finally, that for as long as capitalism existed in South Africa, South Africa has always been a regional economy. The mines, the workers who worked on the mines in South Africa, they haven't always been South African. They came from Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Malawi,
Mozambique.
So there's a sense in which I think South Africans lack, they need better education about their place in Africa.
Okay, so you would say South Africa is a nation that's caught in between its past and maybe its future.
It's still living in the baggage of its past. I think is still overwhelming. We can celebrate some of the things that are great about it, the sort of resilience of its people in fighting apartheid, the heroes that Mandela, Sisulu, Katrada, etc. But I think Mbeki. But more than that, I think we haven't yet made this new society. There's a new society, but it's only for a few. And for most white South Africans, it's wonderful. It's great. They're better off. They can go wherever they want to. For the black middle class, it's fine. But for most black South Africans, the country is the same or it's worse.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have much time to go in, but I know that in 2 days' time, we would know, obviously, the results of these elections. This was Professor Sean Jacobs, who's from Cape Town, currently at the New School here in New York. Thank you. Stay tuned, and I'm Fungai Maboreke.